the problem of free will and determinism. Last session, we were talking about the problem of free will, and we broke it down into a conceptual problem and an existential problem. The existential problem was roughly, does free will exist? Do we have it? But in order to answer that question, you first have to figure out what free will is. So that is the conceptual problem. What's free will? And we discussed how you could use other concepts using the tool of conceptual analysis to connect your ideas about free will to other concepts like causation, moral responsibility, maybe the meaning of life, to help you understand what free will is. So another popular topic is the existence of God, and we can connect free will to almost everything. So we could connect it to God by asking, is it possible for humans to have free will if God has perfect foreknowledge of the future? We could also ask questions about God's omnipotence. If God is omnipotent, it means he has perfect control over everything. But if God has omnipotence and hence perfect control over everything, then how do we have control over our own actions? Wouldn't he have control and we have none? It seems like a zero-sum game. So there are a bunch of different concepts that you could bring in to the conceptual analysis, and you can make your concept map on your own and start thinking about this. Which concepts do you think are most important to free will? And we, in this class, though, are going to be looking at a pretty narrow set of issues. We are going to be talking about free will as it relates to moral responsibility, and we are going to be relating today free will to the idea of a causal type of determinism. Okay, so moral responsibility we'll get into a bit next session. Okay, so the problem of free will and determinism can be broken down into two parts, the correlation problem and the explanation problem. You'll be looking at these more in detail in your reading for this session. Let's start with the correlation problem. The correlation problem can be expressed as a question. Is it metaphysically possible for a human, an ordinary human like us, to exercise free will when determinism is true? Okay, so now that we have this question, we have another nice yes or no split. You can either say yes in response to this question, or you can answer no. Now, how are you supposed to get traction on which way you should go? Well, if you recall last time, we considered some thought experiments and an argument that was supposed to push you towards that no answer. So the thought experiment involved Joe, and Joe was born in a world where determinism is true, and everything he did down to the tiniest detail was fixed by the facts of the past and the laws of nature long before he was born, way at the beginning of the universe. And then we asked, if that's how Joe's life unfolds, is he free? Is he in control of what he's doing? Is it up to him when he goes ahead and kills Bob at some point in his life that was predetermined by the laws and the facts of the past? We also considered an argument called the consequence argument that asked us whether or not you think there's room for control by humans if we are just playing out the consequences of the laws of nature and the facts of the past, and we have no control over the laws of nature or the facts of the past. So the question there is, how can we possibly have control over the consequences of the laws of nature and the facts of the past if we don't have any control over the laws of the past? Okay, so those are designed to push you into this no answer here. Now, it's always possible that you don't feel very pushed by those arguments. You think you have a response to the consequence argument. We looked at a way you might go about attacking one of the premises. And maybe when you're confronted with that story about Joe killing Bob, you don't have the intuition that the people who say no have, that no, Joe can't possibly be in control in that situation. Maybe your intuition is that no, he can be, and you just have to hear me tell the story about how control works, and you'll understand that Joe does have the kind of control required for free will. And so if you're on this side of the divide, you're accepting. So if you're on this side of the divide, we're going to say that you accept a compossibilist account of free will. Now, if instead you say, no, I don't think it's possible to act freely when determinism is true, something's going wrong in those scenarios, then we're going to say that you adopt some kind of incompossibilist account of free will. Okay, so once again, we've structured the problem so that there's this nice, neat divide between two groups, the people who say yes and the people who say no. Now, who's right? That's where the arguments and thought experiments come in to kind of push people one way or the other. Okay, just to make sure that we're all on the same page, why those names to the solution to the correlation problem came about. The idea here is that philosophers are giving a name to two views about the relationship between free will and determinism. And the relationship that they're talking about here is compossibility. So the question is, does a compossibility relation hold between free will and determinism? And it's to that question, does this relationship hold between the two, that people are saying yes or no? And so since that is compossible is in the name of the relation, that's why philosophers say, yeah, if you think it holds, that's why you're a compossibilist. And if you think it doesn't hold, that's why you're an incompossibilist. And in this literature, if you see the letters IN before a word, that means that the thing that's coming is false. So indeterminism means determinism is false, and so on. Okay, so that's how these names come about. And that means that it's easier to track that yes or no divide that we talked about here, rather than calling it the yes answer, no answer. We have words that make it easy to know exactly what problem we're tracking at the time. Okay, so the correlation problem is going to set up, for some people, a further problem. So let's put the correlation problem back up. Okay, so here we have the correlation problem. We're asking, does that compossibility relationship hold between free will and determinism, such that there's some possible world where both of them coexist, the free will and the determinism? And if you say yes, you're a compossibilist, and you're going to have to give your own account of free will, and we will look at those coming up. But for now, to get the problem laid out, the so-called problem of free will and determinism, what's going on here is they said there's no problem, there's no conflict, there's nothing to be learned really from thinking about determinism and with respect to free will. But the people over here who say no, the incompossibilists, they are taking on a new project, because they're saying no, there's some necessary condition on free will that cannot be satisfied when determinism is true. So the question then is, what is that condition? Why is it that they can't satisfy it when determinism is true? So those are two different questions, and they're part of the explanation problem. Okay, so the explanation problem consists in two different questions. First, what's the condition on free will that you cannot satisfy when determinism is true? That's if you're incompossibilist and you actually think you cannot satisfy all the necessary conditions when determinism is true. Now you have to tell us why. What condition is it that you think isn't being satisfied? Maybe there's more than one. And then which feature of that world where determinism is true is making it the case that you can't be free? In your reading for today, these are E1 and E2 of the explanation problem. Okay, just to make sure we're on the same page here, when we start asking the question, what condition on free will can't be satisfied when determinism is true, don't get caught up in a conversational implicature. So it might seem that by asking that question, we're implying conversationally that it is possible to satisfy this condition when indeterminism is true, right? So if determinism is false, you can't satisfy it. And because you're drawing this distinction between determinism and indeterminism, it might seem that you're conversationally implying that you're picking on determinism because you mean to imply that the alternative allows for the satisfaction of condition C. But that's not actually implied here. That's still an open part of the investigation. whether or not, if we go to worlds where indeterminism is true, are we going to be in better shape? Okay. And actually, that's the next part of the problem. So it seems like the problem of determinism is intimately connected with this other problem, the problem of indeterminism. And roughly speaking, the problem of indeterminism is just, is it possible to exercise free will when indeterminism is true? Does some kind of indeterminism help you to act freely? So let's put that up on the board too. Okay, so the question here is, does some kind of indeterminism help us to act freely? And again, setting it this way makes it easy to see what the options are. That's either yes or no. Either indeterminism does help, so that there's some condition you can satisfy when indeterminism is true that you couldn't satisfy when determinism was false. Or you're going to say no here, in which case you're saying that, well, we can't satisfy this condition when determinism is true, and we still can't satisfy it when determinism is false, and that's all the options. So we don't have free will. Okay, so the options here, again, are yes and no. So the yes or no here is another fundamental divide between how people think about free will. Okay. If you answer yes here, you're giving some kind of libertarian account of free will. Okay, so a libertarian account of free will would be a type of incompossibilist account. Okay. And then the other type of incompossibilist account that you could give is this no answer. And since the no here means that we couldn't have free will when determinism is true, we still can't have it when determinism is false. And that's all of metaphysically possible worlds, right, that we're talking about. There's no spot left over where we might still find free will. So it means that there's no metaphysically possible world where determinism is true. So we call this an impossibilist account. There's a difference between saying no one, not even God, can have free will, and just limiting it to it's impossible for us. So we're not going to pay attention to that distinction in this class, but it does matter if you're taking a more advanced class on free will. That would be something that you'd have to pay attention to. Okay, so now we have the board kind of set up here with all the options. We'll put the compossibilist account label back up here so you can keep track. Okay, so now the options for solving the problem of free will and determinism are laid out. You can either say, yes, you can act freely when determinism is true, and then try to give an account of free will where that makes sense. If you try to go that route, what you're trying to do is to give a compossibilist account. If you don't think it's possible to exercise free will when determinism is true, then you're going to have some kind of incompossibilist account, but it depends on how you feel about what's going on when indeterminism is true, which account you're going to go for. If you think that it's possible to exercise free will when indeterminism is true, then you're going to be giving a libertarian account of free will. And if you don't, then you're going to be giving some kind of impossibilist account of free will. Now, just one note, we're using the term libertarian here. In free will, the word libertarianism actually has a meaning that's a little different than we're using it here. A libertarian is someone who thinks that we are free and also accepts a libertarian account of free will, according to which there's a necessary condition on free will that you can't satisfy when determinism is true, but you can satisfy it in conditions where determinism is false. Okay, so in other words, libertarianism is a type of free willist view. It's a solution to the existential problem of free will, and it also tells you a solution to the conceptual problem of free will by telling you which condition goes unsatisfied when determinism is true and why. So just one more thing before we sign off today, I just want to say a few more words about indeterminism and how it's related to determinism so that you have a clear picture of what options are available to you if you want to say that indeterminism helps you to act freely in some way. What is indeterminism and how could it help? But before I erase these from the board, I just want to emphasize that now we have a picture of what the options are for you to develop in your own theorizing about free will in this class. So next session, we're going to start in on the manipulation argument, and that argument is going to be the argument you're going to respond to in your final paper. And you don't need to read a bunch of philosophers to find out what you should say about that argument. We're going to be looking at that argument, and the expectation is that you're going to bring your own background to bear on that question. You're going to bring in your new toolkit from Unit 1, the logic and the conceptual analysis and counterexamples, and you're going to use that toolkit to assess the manipulation argument and decide what you think it shows, if anything. Okay, and in that process of evaluating and responding to the manipulation argument, you should be taking a stance on one of these accounts of free will. So at the end of that process, you should have a story in your own mind about which of these accounts of free will you think is most likely to be correct. So you should end up with a rough idea of what your own solution to the problem of free will is, the problem that's the real problem, the conceptual problem of free will. Okay, let's look at indeterminism just quick before we sign off. Okay, let's go back to determinism quickly. That was the view that the laws of nature plus the facts of the past make one unique future inevitable. Right? There's only one way the future could unfold, given the laws of nature and the facts of the past. Okay, so this is a very strong view. It means that literally not even God, right, an omnipotent God coming in, couldn't make the future diverge from the future that was given by the laws and the facts of the past. There's an interesting paper by Jim Stone if you want to read about that. If you're curious about it, I can let you know where to find that. So what we're basically saying when we say that determinism is true is that there are no options in the way that the world unfolds. So we're going to express that by saying there's zero actual sequence leeway in a world where determinism is true. Okay, so there's literally nothing that could happen other than what's been prefixed by the laws and the facts of the past. Not even God can make things happen differently. So if there's any leeway at all, then indeterminate is true. So if your world works like this, you get to a point in the timeline, and then it could go one way or it could go the other way, and nothing settles it. There could be some causation there, but it's not the kind of causation that guarantees what's going to happen next. It's just this one particular thing. It could limit the options to maybe like 2 things or 3 things that could happen next, but it's not just this one block of future just waiting for you out there. Now, there's lots of ways this could happen. There's lots of different ways in which you could have this kind of indeterminism pop up. So for example, we could have a scenario where determinism is almost true, but in the history of the world, there's just one atom that doesn't behave in the way described by determinism. On the far side of the galaxy, there was one atom that kind of zigged when determinism said it should have zagged. And there was this option, there was this openness for a moment in the universe that allowed that one atom to go one way rather than the other. So that would be a kind of near determinism. That's pretty close. And it doesn't seem like that's the kind of indeterminism that would help us act freely. Some atom on the other side of the universe doing something indeterministically. So what kind of indeterminism would help? You know, does it have to be that it's happening all the time? How many options do there have to be? Right? That's going to be a difficult question to answer, because you can think about this as a spectrum from near determinism here right, where it's just that one little atom that behaved crazy, but there was at least that one option in the history of the world. We can think about a world where there's really no laws of nature at all, and everything just happens completely for no reason and kind of chaotically, where there's a maximal amount of actual sequence leeway. So we can think of this on a spectrum from this little atom that might be behaving in a strange way on the corner of the galaxy and nothing else, to the idea that everything's behaving like that atom all the time. There's no laws of nature, there's no causation, things are just doing what they do for no reason whatsoever, right? And down here, that would be, you know, that kind of world where everything is completely chaotic. And in a world like that, we'd have the maximal amount of actual sequence leeway. Okay, there'd be just absolute chaos. The future, there's nothing fixing what happens in the future. Things just unfold. Now, maximal amount of actual sequence leeway, things, going all sorts of different ways at once, and nothing settling it. Doesn't seem like that's really a great world for free will either, right? Because if things are just happening for no reason at all, there's no causation, no laws, then you're not making things happen. Things are just happening to you, right? So it's not like you just get more and more indeterministic stuff going on in the world and you get more and more places where you can act freely. At some point, you're going to end up having so much chaos that you're not going to have free will either. It's just as bad as a world where determinism is true. So the question is there a kind of indeterminism in here that you could spell out that would allow you to say, yeah, when the world works like this, then there's a possibility of exercising free will. Okay, so here we have determinism. This is like the most extreme on this side. There's zero actual sequence leeway, and anything else that's not like that, we use indeterminism as an umbrella term to cover all of this spectrum, where it's near determinism all the way to total chaos. That's all covered by the term indeterminism. So determinism is false. So when you hear the word determinism, just make sure you're thinking zero actual sequence leeway. There's nothing that could happen other than the one thing that's fixed by the laws and the facts of the past. Not even God could change it. And anything that's less strict than that is going to count as indeterminism. And just because indeterminism is true doesn't mean that you can tell much about the world, because it could be almost deterministic, it could be totally chaotic, and then there's a bunch of options in between. And if you like one of those libertarianist accounts of free will, then your job is to figure out one of these in-between worlds probably, and which one is it that is going to make it possible to satisfy that condition on free will that you couldn't satisfy when the world worked like this. Okay, so like I say, next time in the next session, we're going to be talking about the manipulation argument. Hopefully that argument is going to help you decide a little bit more about how to think about these issues and where free will can be, where it can't be, and that will get you started thinking about an idea for your final paper right away, right out of the box here. We don't have to read a ton before you start working on your ideas about your thesis statement and what the support for that thesis statement is. You'll just start getting more and more support as we go on and we read other philosophers and what they have to say about free will. You'll be able to grab that and maybe add it to your paper, make it stronger. But by the end of the manipulation argument session, you should have a pretty fair sense of what you want to say in your final paper, in very broad terms. Okay? All right, see you next session.